Depending on who you ask, open world games are either the greatest thing since sliced bread or a tedious, creatively bankrupt blight upon the entire industry. Ultimately, the answer is probably a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. As a result, it's little surprise that many games start out their life intending to be open world, only for development to be streamlined into something more manageable later on. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video games you didn't realize were originally open world. Number 10, Astro Bot. Let's kick things off with last year's consensus game of the year, Astro Bot. Team Asobi's endlessly charming mascot platformer was widely praised for its fusion of earnest PlayStation nostalgia with outstanding level design and its modest 10-hour length. The game launched with around 80 bite-sized levels lasting 5 to 10 minutes apiece, or if you played those really bitchy hard levels, like an hour apiece. In an interview with Edge shortly before the game's release, director Nicolas Doucet revealed that Astro Bot almost went the open world route. When Doucet and his team were first putting the game together, they considered making it an open world platforming adventure, though they ultimately opted for a more traditional level-based approach, because it granted them more control over the game's variety. And Doucet was probably right to do so. The confined scope of Astro Bot's levels helps it keep a focused experience, even as branching paths and secret areas still promote exploration and curiosity. An open world Astro Bot could work, but in an era of open world oversaturation, something as reined in and strictly curated as Astro Bot feels like an oasis in a desert, not to mention a 10-hour game, bless. Number 9, Halo Combat Evolved. The original Halo went through an intense developmental process before Bungie finally settled on the innovative first-person shooter, which finally came to market. The developer had a bevy of ambitious ideas, which were ultimately scrapped, and one of these was to make the campaign open world, complete with terrain which could be deformed and reshaped by explosions. However, technical limitations of the era eventually resulted in Halo becoming a more hemmed-in linear experience for the most part. Halo's art director, Marcus Leto, finally went into further detail on Twitter, telling a fan that when Bungie was building the very first demo for Halo, the intent was to make the game purely open world. Leto added that the game's much-loved fourth level, the Silent Cartographer, was quote-unquote the closest we got to open world Halo at the time. With the levels shift away from linear corridors toward a more sprawling, explorable island, you can see what they were going for. In the end, it wasn't until 2021's Halo Infinite that the franchise finally offered up an open world campaign. Number 8, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. Though the Metroid franchise is primarily known for its tightly crafted linearity, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption very nearly had substantial open world elements, according to series producer Brian Walker. In an interview with YouTube channel Did You Know Gaming, he revealed an original concept for Metroid Prime 3 saw players operating out of a hub world where they could visit different planets to take on bounties and track down criminals, which would allow them to earn upgrades to both Samus and her ship. But according to Walker, Nintendo bigwigs didn't really understand the concept of a bounty hunter, instead envisioning Samus as an altruistic intergalactic hero, and so the open world idea was quickly killed off. Walter had no hard feelings about the failed pitch though, surmising that his team was best suited to delivering a quote, finely crafted and balanced experience anyway. Interestingly, rumors indicate that the long gestating Metroid Prime 4 Beyond will have the series' most expansive areas to date, though will still steer clear of going fully open world. Number 7, Dead Island 2. As the original Dead Island was an open world game, it was a reasonable expectation that its sequel would also be. But when Dead Island 2 finally came out in 2023, that wasn't quite the case. The game's scope was constrained to a number of smaller, more confined hubs which players could explore. And though Dead Island 2 was a surprisingly fun time given its hellish development, it's little surprise that the end product was very different from the original vision. The earlier versions of the game, developed by Jaeger Development and Sumo Digital, before Dambuster Studios finally came aboard and rebooted the project, were far more of a card-carrying open world game set across the state of California, rather than mere hubs of Los Angeles. And while Dead Island 2's eventual linearity left some players disappointed, it at the very least allowed Dambuster to control the game's scope and actually get it out the door, which was really something after so many years in development. Best of all, it went on to become a surprise success story, scoring solid reviews and selling 4 million units to date. Number 6. Armored Core 6: Fires of Rubicon. From Software proved beyond any doubt that they could absolutely handle an open world game with their masterful Elden Ring, and at one point their follow-up title almost adopted the very same style. In an interview shortly after the release of Armored Core 6: Fires of Rubicon, director Masaru Yamamura revealed that during early development, From Software flirted with the idea of making the long-awaited franchise reboot an open world game. Yamamura said that the team discussed developing Armored Core 6 into a more open style, which would allow for greater exploration and movement, though ultimately they decided against it, feeling that it would take away some of the series' charm. Yamamura added that an open world style would have required the team to scale back the game's AC customization features in order to ensure that every loadout could accommodate a huge map, and they just didn't want to do that. While IP reboots often do something drastic to differentiate themselves from what came before, Armored Core 6 laudably stayed the course and retained the purity of the series rather than cribbing ideas from the developer's successes elsewhere. Number 5. Bayonetta 3. The beauty of the Bayonetta franchise is the contained intensity of each stage, hurling players down a largely linear path, but filling it to the brim with enemies to waste. But Bayonetta 3 very nearly took the series in a semi-open world direction, according to a report published by journalist Imran Khan shortly after the game's release. As it turns out, this was the reason that Bayonetta 3 took the better part of 5 years to release following its announcement. Platinum Games initially conceived the game inside of a large hub world, which would have sent Bayonetta to a series of smaller, expansive worlds. Khan compared it to both Astral Chain and Super Mario 64, yet despite the developers spending a long time working on the idea, pacing problems led Nintendo to ask the team to scale their vision back. And so Platinum Games reverted to developing Bayonetta 3 in a more conventional style, akin to its two predecessors, though it's worth noting that many of the game's stages were considerably larger this time around, likely a carryover from the original design intent. Number 4. Alan Wake. Though Alan Wake is a linear action-adventure game like most of Remedy's AAA titles, the developer originally sought to ambitiously deviate from the Max Payne series formula by developing their new title as an open-world survival horror experience. With the ability to explore an open, sprawling city, Alan Wake was likened less to Max Payne than Grand Theft Auto, albeit with survival elements where players needed to craft and scavenge during the day to prepare for the dangers of the nighttime. However, Remedy struggled for 3 years to develop a game whose sandbox-style gameplay vibed with its more thriller-centric story, and after realizing it simply wasn't working, the team pulled the band-aid off by spending several months reworking Alan Wake into a more linear episodic adventure. Remedy retained as many assets as possible from the open world version of the game, and that included the map of the town Bright Falls, but then they streamlined the scope into something that better suited the existing story and tone. Number 3. Call of Duty Black Ops 3. Though Call of Duty finally embraced an open world campaign with its acclaimed most recent entry, Black Ops 6, it almost happened an entire decade ago in Black Ops 3. While Black Ops 3's campaign did feature a more open, less linear level design than prior entries and supported 4-player co-op, it was nevertheless scaled back from a full-fat open world campaign, which developer Treyarch apparently spent like a year working on. According to intrepid reporter Jason Schreier, Black Ops 3's original open world was scrapped mid-development, forcing the dev team into a period of crunch to complete a more traditional Call of Duty campaign in time for the game's set-in-stone November 2015 release. In late 2022, extensive work-in-progress images from the open world campaign were leaked online, showing off numerous large, interconnected areas far beyond the scope of a typical game in the franchise, at the time at least. On one hand, the reworked campaign is probably the series' wackiest ever, but the rushed development time might also explain why it felt close to incomprehensible at the time. Number 2. The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Part 2 had such a confidence of vision throughout, regardless of how some fans perceived it, and it's tough to believe that the game was almost something completely different. Yet last year's superb making-of documentary, Grounded 2 Making The Last of Us Part 2, saw the game's co-director Anthony Newman reveal that The Last of Us Part 2 was initially developed as an open-world game. Franchise co-creator Neil Druckmann wanted the sequel to be starkly different to its predecessor, and so for the first 4 or 5 months of development, Part 2 had an open world structure with hub worlds which Newman likened to Bloodborne, where the world would grow larger the more it's explored. Ultimately, however, this style of gameplay just didn't line up with the story that Druckmann and co were telling, so the decision was made to retreat into a more linear experience. You certainly can't knock Naughty Dog's ambition here, but given the series' story-forward approach and how open-world games can be really bad at holding you into a story when there's so much to do, it definitely made sense to let the story dictate the mode of gameplay. Number 1. Slitterhead. And finally, though Slitterhead wasn't a critical darling compared to most of the games on this list, this deeply unhinged horror action game from Silent Hill Siren and Gravity Rush creator Keiichiro Toyama still has its many fans. While the body-swapping horror game is a relatively linear experience segmented into clear levels, in an interview with VGC last year, Toyama revealed that he originally intended for the game to have a fully open-world structure. Yet this ended up being scrapped for the most brutally utilitarian of reasons. That is, the game's budget simply didn't support a fleshed out open world format. After all, Slitterhead is very clearly the lowest budgeted game on this list, and the only one that's carrying a AA title, so it's little surprise that Toyama's madcap vision couldn't quite stretch to a larger scale. Considering that the end result was already pretty polarizing, it likely would have been even more unwieldy as an open world experience, so it's probably for the best.